Let's take a quick dive now into the book of Lamentations, beginning with the name Lamentations. That's what we call the book in English. That's what the title comes from, the Latin. However, in Hebrew, the word is ekah, and that's because Hebrew books will often name the books after the first word in the book. For instance, Genesis is Bareshit, Numbers is Bamidbar, and so Lamentations begins in chapter 1, verse 1 with the question, how lonely? Question that repeats again in chapter 2, verse 1, and chapter 4, verse 1. How? Ekah. The book Lamentations is not the only Lamentations that we find in Israel, although it's the only ones that we have in the Old Testament as a book. In 609 BC, Josiah is killed by Pharaoh Necho. We're told that Jeremiah composes laments. 2 Chronicles 35, verse 25. Jeremiah composes laments for Josiah. They are written in the laments. What laments? We don't know. We're pretty confident that we don't have them. Perhaps there are some psalms that are laments, but probably not these laments in question. And the book of Lamentations are not the laments from 2 Chronicles 35. But it does show that Lamentations, or laments, was something that existed in the genre of Israelite literature. Although we have to ask ourselves, why? Why Lamentations? Why laments? And really it comes down to, at least in terms of wisdom, instructing how we weep, how we mourn, especially over something that's related specifically to sin, although the Lamentations can also refer to something that doesn't have to do with sin. The book is most likely written post 586 BC, after the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple. It really seems to have the feeling of a funeral dirge, but really it comes down to a recognition that this is worship. This is a recognition of what Israel has caused for itself. This is crying out in faith to the only one who can help, crying out to God for deliverance. So it's a lament, but it's also a prayer. It's also an ask for God to intervene, a recognition of why this has happened, a recognition of what needs to happen in the future, but also the recognition of the laments that are going on in people's hearts. According to the Septuagint, Jeremiah is the one who wrote this particular book, and that has been the tradition for some time, although the book itself doesn't say who wrote the book. As I mentioned earlier, the book of Lamentations was written likely after the fall of Jerusalem, perhaps by hands of an eyewitness, perhaps by an eyewitness named Jeremiah. The question, though, related to the fall of Jerusalem is the I that occasionally shows up within the book. Someone is talking in the first person. For instance, we read in Leviticus chapter 1, verse 9, her uncleanness was in her skirts. She took no thought of her future. Therefore, her fall is terrible. She has no comforter. And then we get a first person. O Lord, behold my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed. Again, verse 11, all her people groan as they search for bread. They trade their treasures for food to revive their strength. Look, O Lord, and see, for I am despised. Again, verse 12, is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look and see if there is in my sorrow any sorrow like my sorrow, which was brought upon me, which the Lord inflicted on the day of his fierce anger. This continues in several places throughout the book, leaving us with the question, who is the I? Is the I Jerusalem? Is the I a narrator? Is the I supposed to be collective Israel? One scholar at least has suggested that this emphasizes the idea of aloneness, that Israel, in the midst of her sorrow for going into exile, feels alone. And so Israel says, I, not us, but I. There's only one and we're on our own. The book of Lamentations also moves as an acrostic. Chapter 3, there are 3 verses per letter. Chapter 5, there is only 1 verse per letter. And actually, although there are 22 verses, it's not really an acrostic. In chapters 2, 3, and 4, it is an acrostic, which is interesting. We have a decline, as it were. Chapter 3, all 3, an acrostic, starts with the same letter. Chapter 4, 44 lines, there's 2 for each letter, and again, it's all in the same letter. And then chapter 5, 22 lines, 1 for each letter in terms of number, but not an acrostic. We wonder why. Why is this in an acrostic? Perhaps it's a memory aid, although then we're left wondering why chapter 5 does not use an acrostic. O. Palmer Robertson says that really what we have here is grief from A to Z, which is certainly true, but it's hard to know if that's exactly what the author intended. We also, as Robertson has pointed out, have a decline to the point where in chapter 5, the author perhaps is so frustrated that not only is he writing fewer lines, he doesn't even care to put in the effort to make it an acrostic. Almost think of it as a crash and burn. We started so well in chapter 3, 3 verses per letter, all an acrostic, and we end in chapter 5, just one verse per letter, but not in an acrostic, not in any set order, not even really caring. Another issue within Lamentations is the pattern of lament, so to speak, the meter of lament. We've talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the semester when we looked at the book of Psalms. We have a pattern in terms of the meter of 3 clauses or 3 beats and then 2. 3 syllables, then 2 syllables, or 3 words, then 2 words. Sometimes that 3 and 2 is called the pattern of lament. However, that is not universally accepted. Not everybody believes that there is such thing as a meter and a pattern of lament. So even as we consider the book of Lamentations, we have to ask, is it in the pattern of lament because it's lamenting, or is it in the book of Lamentations and lamenting, therefore they wrote it in that particular meter, or none of the above? Is it just coincidence that's written in that particular meter? It's an ongoing debate not only in the book of Lamentations, but really for Psalms of lament as well. Is there a meter of lament? We have to keep in mind as we're looking at the book of Lamentations that we're not really looking at wisdom literature per se. We're really more looking at a poetic book, similar to the other Psalms of Lamentations found in the book of Psalms. The book of Lamentations, for instance, assumes that there's a covenant and bases the whole book upon that covenant between God and Israel. And it's specific to Israel. That is different from other wisdom literature. It's different from the international field that we often find in wisdom literature, because Lamentations is concerned only with Israel, not with other institutions or other nations at this point in history, only concerned with Israel's response to the situation that it finds itself in, which is why in chapter 3, verses 39 through 42, and again in chapter 5, verses 15 through 16, we see confession, as Israel is recognizing that this is all because they're being punished by God. They have sinned against him, and so they are confessing. And not just confessing, they are crying out for forgiveness and crying out for mercy and restoration. Lamentations 2:13, who can heal you? Chapter 2, verses 18 through 19, Israel basically says that maybe there's a chance God will forgive them. They're not super confident, but they know there's a chance, enough that they might as well try it. So they're told to humble themselves before God. They're told to confess. They're told to weep and to wail for their sin with the hopes that God will indeed forgive. And we're reminded in chapter 3, verses 22 through 23, that God's love is indeed steadfast. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness, O Lord. They understand that their only hope is the very person that's delivering them. Only God can rescue them. That's something that is evident in chapter 4, verse 22, chapter 5, verse 1, chapter 5, verses 19 through 22. Lamentations, as I said, is not just a funeral dirge. It's not just said in order to say it, but it is a cry to God, deliver us, lamenting the situation, understanding that they themselves have caused it, but yet still crying out to him for deliverance and for restoration in Israel.